Nadia, welcome.
And thank you so much. Thank you, Anne, for introducing me, and thank you, the seminar, for inviting me. And I'm very happy, and it's a great pleasure and an honor. I also want to thank Elizabeth for agreeing to be the discussant for this talk. I first wrote on Chekhov many years ago. I returned to Chekhov about 10 years ago and published an article which was called The Child in Chekhov. This article became the foundation for the book that I'm discussing today. I have always been interested in the interplay between socio-political change, culture, and literature. My book on Chekhov approaches the writer's work on children from this angle of vision. Before I felt confident about offering the readers a full monograph on the topic, I had to learn quite a bit more. In a way, the impetus for the project was the result of my own anxiety of ignorance about the issue, the anxiety I shared both with Chekhov's contemporaries and with his characters. Chekhov's interest in children is undeniable. During his rather short writing career, he produced close to 300 child characters of all ages, belonging to nearly all classes of Russian society, living in very different family circumstances. Throughout 1/3 of his creative life, Chekhov wrote about children. And 20 of Chekhov's stories, written between 1880 and 88, focus exclusively on children. We know that Chekhov was very well read in educational matters, was familiar with publications for children and about children, wrote about children in his work as a journalist, and considered specialty in pediatrics. His biographers and some critics invariably bring up Chekhov's own difficult childhood. We all know the phrase «В детстве у меня не было детства». Those interests and experiences are not enough, however, in my opinion, to justify Chekhov's pointed focus on children in his work. More important, I think, was the unique position that the study of childhood occupied in Chekhov's society. Consequently, in this book, I wanted to offer my readers an approximation of an immersive experience in Chekhov's world. The purpose was to see how various contemporaneous discourses on the child might have affected the formation of Chekhov's literary model of childhood. The design was simple, the scope of the inquiry quite ambitious. The first part of the book deals with context, literary, educational, and medical opinions and views on childhood in Chekhov's time. And there are 3 chapters there. The first one is The Child Imagined, the literary canon. I discuss the canonic works of Tolstoy, Aksakov, and Goncharov. The second one is The Humanization Project, deals with education, and 2 heroes of that chapter are Tolstoy and Konstantin Ushinsky. The next one is The Child Examined, and in this chapter I talk about pedagogical psychology and various actors. I describe various actors engaged in child studies. The second part is a close reading of Chekhov's stories about children. The first chapter is called The Emergence of Language, the writer and the child. The next one is The Child's Text. The next one is Kids at Play. and then Farewell to Childhood, where I discuss the step. And the last chapter is the after childhood. The title of the conclusion is The Anxiety of Ignorance. In my analysis of Chekhov's text, I looked for an interpretive key that would refocus critical attention away from a search for a unifying, explanatory message in Chekhov's fiction, in general, and in my case, about children in particular. This goal was prompted by my investigation of the period and by the challenges of interpretation that the writer poses for his readers. And these are, of course, very well known to everybody who is here today, and will be very brief, listing those challenges. As Andrew Durkin has shown, at the basis of Chekhov's perceived difference as a writer is a new kind of engagement between the text and the reader. This engagement forces the reader to be actively involved in all areas of representation and makes the reader work harder. Additionally, it purposefully encourages diverse interpretations. This unique relationship is the result of Chekhov's laconicism, compression of form, apparent randomness of description. We know that Chekhov's openings dispense with introductory descriptions, elucidations, explanations, and we also know that his closures are always open-ended. This open-endedness of Chekhov's narratives and the writer's refusal to offer a unifying explanatory message that would articulate his position clearly and give us some advice as how to read his work, resulted in the profusion of many different Chekhovs in Chekhoviana. The Russian critic Sukhich observed that critics have been engaged in the game of переодевания, putting Chekhov in a new garb, to avoid what is, in my opinion, a futile search for an easily digestible meaning of Chekhov's work. I focused instead on how Chekhov's characters learn and how they arrive at interpretations. The connections to the preoccupations of the period became immediately apparent. In Chekhov's time, which I would call the second age of learning, or we could say the silver age of learning, education and rearing of Russia's children came to be viewed as a matter crucial for the country's future. Overcoming the anxiety of ignorance about the issue led to an intense period of pedagogical self-education and of the reassessment of previously held pedagogical truths. This process begins before the emancipation with the writings of Vissarion Belinsky, particularly important in this regard. He was writing these articles in 1830s and 40s. By the end of 1880s, a score of conceptual and practical issues had already been posed, if not settled. These issues were directly linked to the Emancipation era resolve to transform the society of masters and men into one capable of raising children in the spirit of universal humanity and opportunity. The vital importance of studying the child's physiological and psychological makeup comprehensively was established by Pirogov and in much more detail by Konstantin Ushinsky in his highly influential pedagogical anthropology. The progressive schools of child rearing and schooling were now based on the idea of a harmonious development of the child's physiological, mental, emotional, and moral abilities. The proliferation of educational health manuals for schools and parents, mothers' and fathers' diaries, illustrated magazines for children, and of psychologists' own recorded observations of their children that began in the early post-reform period was still in the 1880s a conspicuous feature of Russian life. As a result of a collective effort to build a cohesive model of maturation, literary, cultural, and scientific projections of childhood became mutually constitutive fields, interacting with each other in various ways and blurring the borders between literary and non-literary discourses. The psychobiographical approach, as well as direct engagement with literature as a trusted source of psychological insights by educators, psychologists, and writers of child manuals, remained a notable feature of educational writings. The desire to pin Chekhov down in an explanatory matrix that would neutralize the perceived inconsistencies and faults of Chekhov's approach to writing found its fulfillment in most critical appraisals of Chekhov's stories about children. The writer's early critics, in particular, saw the seemingly problematic features of Chekhov's style as necessitated by his literary subjects' limitations, immaturity. According to this view, Chekhov's writing on children, focusing as it does on the unformed minds of young characters, was justified in its narrative ambiguities. Therefore, the overall message, they finally could find the message of the stories could be presented as explicit. Chekhov's children are saintly and pure, and the writer's putative intention is to demonstrate the destruction of the child's innocence and goodness by the adult world. This reductive assessment of Chekhov's literary model of childhood has remained essentially unchanged since his stories about children first appeared in print. In part, this misreading of Chekhov is the result of an established tendency to see his work in clearly set stages. So whatever was written before 88 is considered period of apprenticeship, and often, particularly in the early criticism, deemed unworthy of his talents. Another, or understood simply, or not worthy of too much interpretation. Another reason for viewing Chekhov's child stories as straightforward and unchallenging has been the critical tendency to conflate the biographical, and the fictional in Chekhov's work. In many critical assessments, Chekhov's personal and public statements in defense of children have been used to articulate the writer's literary model of childhood. Chekhov's medical training is often brought in to explain his approach as well. Overall, in the case of Chekhov's stories about children, the critics' reliance on the reductive scheme of saintly children, чистые, простые, святые, who are crushed by the outside world, appear to eliminate the need for an exhaustive analysis of Chekhov's model of childhood. So consequently, the critical attention to these stories has been sporadic and their analysis brief. The temptation to see Chekhov's literary creations about children as a physician's case histories, or see them as faithfully reproduced snippets of reality in need of society's attention because the situation was awful for children and the writer himself did not have a childhood, is understandable because the primary challenge of interpreting Chekhov's work stems from its direct and continuous engagement in a complex, multidimensional conversation with many participants. In the case of children's stories, these include his fellow writers, critics, psychologists, educators, visual artists who contributed to the dailies he wrote for, as well as illustrators of his work. When the reader is confronted with narratives that foreground the multiplicity of competing and equally powerful voices, some of which echo Chekhov's personal statements on the issue or bring to mind his mythologized biography, the conflation of public, private, and literary discourses and interpretation seems unavoidable. But Chekhov was very well aware of the difference between literary and non-literary discourses. There's a famous letter, which I call the slave letter to Suvorin, written in 89. It offers an example. Everybody knows this letter, of course. Offers an example of Chekhov's abridged pseudo-autobiography, where the documentary, in this case, the outlines of the writer's own biography, is accommodated in a fictional narrative. Напишите-ка рассказ о том, как молодой человек, сын крепостного, бывший лавочник, гимназист и студент, воспитанный на чинопочитании, целовании поповских рук, поклонении чужим мыслям, выдавливает из себя по каплям раба, и как он, проснувшись в одно прекрасное утро, чувствует, что в его жилах течет уже не рабская кровь, а настоящая человеческая. The plot of this imaginary story, and it is designated by Chekhov as such, «Напишите-ка рассказ», centers on the awakening of a character based on a historical figure, the writer himself, whose background has been modified for a greater narrative impact. Chekhov was not a serf's son, and he was not a shopkeeper. In this literary configuration that underscores the character's transformation, Chekhov's father's life story of a shopkeeper and a serf's son is superimposed upon Chekhov's own. So we see here, this letter articulates the singularity of literary discourse, and it offers a glimpse of how lived experience can be reimagined in fiction. The difference between biography, autobiography, and fiction is clearly established here by Chekhov and elsewhere. This, however, was not the case for critics or those engaged in child studies. There was a definite blurring of the boundaries between literary and non-literary narratives, as I mentioned before. Psychologists and educators routinely base their findings and conclusions on literary works. Visual images found in photographic records or in works of art were commonly used to substantiate particular scholarly positions. Chekhov appropriated current scholarly knowledge, often employing shared methods of discovery, analysis, and argumentative strategies to depict the state of childhood in his fiction, but with different goals in mind. Chekhov's very early story, Dva Romana, that was written in 83, is an excellent example of a deliberate generic dislocation where the structure and language of a medical case history and that of journalistic reportage become embedded and transformed in a literary work. Roman, of course, can signify both a love affair and a novel in Russian. The first part of Chekhov's story describes a physician's marriage, and it employs the devices of the medical genre. It has an obligatory record of social family history, clinical observation, diagnosis, treatment, and a lavish use of Latin and French. Depends on scholarly discourse in language structure and references. But despite the first-person narrator's tone of objective distance, in this fragment, Chekhov turns his subjects into the story of his subjects into a mock medical inquiry. Chekhov's distinct understanding of the difference between literary and non-literary discourses is also directly articulated in his autobiography. He writes, "The conventions of creative writing do not always allow for a complete adherence to scientific data. However, this adherence must be perceptible within the underlying literary conventions. That is, the reader or the spectator must be aware of the conventions, yet be convinced that the writer is well informed." In two romances, as in Chekhov's early fiction overall, the manipulation of the difference served to produce laughter. A similar objective guided Chekhov's reliance on cultural stereotypes. Chekhov's stories about children demonstrate the writer's close familiarity with current scientific knowledge, but the data is skillfully woven into compressed fictional narratives that fulfill many other goals for each story. How do we analyze the text and how do we connect the context and the text? This is challenging. Chekhov's compression of form does not allow for an extensive elaboration. Allusions to context are often hidden and have to be deciphered. A seemingly minor reference or a quote embedded in Chekhov's description of a character's musings evokes a wealth of highly influential ideas on education, as in the story At Home. A mother's admonitions to her children reflect shared understandings of normative behavior, as in Cook. In Grisha, Chekhov depicts a preverbal child and his attempts at communication. These descriptions gesture to Russian educators and psychologists' views on early childhood. Chekhov's portrayal of peasant children engages with Russia's ideas on educating the peasantry, with social mythology and traditional peasant culture. In addition, Chekhov's creative appropriation of other writers' language and thematics, a defining feature of his poetics, must be accounted for in any discussion of the interactions between Chekhov's context and his texts. I arranged the chapters in the second part of the book in accordance with the protagonist's developmental stages, from preverbal child to a 13-year-old Varka in Sleepy. I also paid attention to those areas of child development that were prioritized in the writings of those engaged in child studies. Here is a quick summary of the prevalent views on the child at the time Chekhov was writing his stories. The essential task of scholarly inquiry was to determine how the child develops and learns. Maturation was viewed as a continuous and gradual process in which the psychic and the physical were equally engaged and mutually dependent. Each stage of age-related development was determined to have its own unique features and a timetable that could not be artificially changed or forced, and each child was considered unique in his individuality. Rearing and schooling, воспитание и обучение, stood for a focused shaping of the child's body and mind by parents, educators, physicians, and psychologists. Therefore, educators paid increased attention to children's hygiene, physical exercise, nutrition, and environment, particularly in early childhood. the desire to improve the child's intellect and regulate his emotions necessitated the investigation of cognition, imagination, symbolic thinking, volition, and ethics. Educators emphasized the importance of play in socialization, as well as in mental and physical development. Guided by its trust in the power of science, the pedagogical movement of the period articulated strategies for transforming the nation by educating its children and rearing its children right. I wanted today to talk about two stories written by Chekhov, but have time only for one, and I'm going to do the funny one. It's called Сапоги в смятку. It was written in 1886, and I translated the title as Soft-Boiled Boots. It is a handwritten story for the children of Chekhov's friends, illustrated with images cut out from satirical and children's journals by Chekhov himself. It is perhaps the only story in the writer's body of work on the topic which is written both for children and about children. The story is erotic take on moralistic narratives for children, the intention confirmed by Chekhov in a private letter to Kisilova, where the genre of the parody text is defined as something edifying and illustrated, назидательно иллюстрированное. This story is a perfect example of the visually dynamic aspect of Chekhov's writing. Moreover, its collage-like quality is significant in its direct and graphic manifestation of Chekhov's pointed intertextuality, or writing about what has been written by others, as well as of the use of the images produced by others for his own aims. The common plot of such edifying and illustrated narratives establishes a conflict based on the child's unacceptable conduct. It is followed by an elaboration of the behavior's bad impact on others, and a typical closure emphasizes the child's newly gained awareness of the norm and describes the modifications in the child's behavior. Direct appeals to the young readers, as in Now You See Children, was a regular feature of this literature, and it aimed at establishing a relationship of kindness and trust between the narrator and the children. The narrator was guiding the children to the appropriate perception and solution of the problem. In contrast to Chekhov's published work, Soft-Boiled Boots had specific addressees, Chekhov's friends, the Kisilovs, and their children, to whose habits and idiosyncrasies it often alludes. Moreover, as in the writer's correspondence with his brother Alexander and his friends, the story is written as a private communication where the subversion of the norms of personal and literary behavior is allowed and even expected. Intended both for children and adults, Chekhov's story of family life is violent, scatological in its details, and merciless in its portrayal of the adult protagonists. The familiar techniques of the penny press employed in Soft-Boiled Boots serve to broadcast the narrative's comic intent. The crossing of the boundaries of the permissible allowed in a private communication is restricted, however, by the limits that Chekhov establishes for himself when creating a private text for children. The violation of the norm in this story occurs primarily in the comic reversal of the household roles and in the story's focus on bodily functions. Any mention or allusions, even veiled, to sexual matters, a frequent topic of conversation in Chekhov's letters to his adult male friends and brothers, are absent. Soft-boiled boots of the title recalls the poetics of the absurd associated with the trifles, as of the penny press. As in the narratives of the penny press, the metaphorical names of the adult characters provide a quick access to the character's stereotypical essence. Mr. Turkey is the author, Archip Indekin. The censor's name is Puzikov, Mr. Belly, and the father's name is Merliton Panteleich Bryuchkin, Mr. Pants. The grandfather's patronymic is based on the word cockroach, Tarakanovich, and the teacher's full name is Darmiton Difteritovich Dyrочkin, which can be loosely translated as Dozy Difteritovich Hole. The play on the titles of the current periodicals, a staple of the penny press, is evident in the invented journal Children's Fatigue, Детское утомление, a comic reference to children's leisure, Детский отдых, a popular publication for children in which such edifying and illustrated stories often appeared, and where Chekhov's brother Mikhail and Kiseleva published their work. The narrative builds on a common subgenre of the trifles, a parody of children's story with a moral in the end. Yet the piece also includes seeds of possible plots, some developed by Chekhov in his published sketches. The mini plot about the good boy Grisha, who is obedient, likes to study, and pinches pennies and apples from his parents to give to the poor, is borrowed by Chekhov from his own The Cook Gets Married. Chekhov will use the little glutton Terenisha's propensity for stealing his father's tobacco to structure his children's story at home. The idea of edification of children by the adults, the guided development informing the progressive ideas on rearing, is at the story's narrative center. The perceived norms of children's behavior, polite, obliging, quiet, and industrious, are contrasted to the way children can be and are, in this story, lazy, mischievous, thieving, and gluttonous. They habitually flout the oft-repeated admonitions to conform to the norm. The adults, who are supposed to model and enform normative behavior, are shown to defy any such expectations. The mother of the family considers herself very smart and sees everybody else as fools because she knows two expressions in French. The father is preoccupied with eating, defecating, and beating his children. The grandfather, who likes to kill bedbugs by smearing them on the wall and fleas by squashing them with his fingers, smells of vinegar, tobacco, and gas. The teacher is a drunk who beats the children, eats with his hands, and so on and so forth. The author, whose portrait is appended after the conclusion, is unable to complete the last chapter of the story because his wife threatens to take his lamp away. The lack of the proper closure is explained by Mr. Turkey's subservient position to his authority figure, the domineering wife. In its interdependence of the visual and verbal, the story evokes the typical features of the Russian lubok and anticipates the modern comic strip and graphic novel. What connects Chekhov's stories to the Russian lubok is its playful artistry, theatricality, and its insistence on the readers' full participation in the experience. The scatological details and the overall silliness of soft-boiled boots can also be viewed as the legacy of an art form that invites the playful, carnivalesque reversal of the status quo and the crossing of the boundaries of the permissible. Chekhov's focus on the changing frames, on the cinematic unfolding of images in time in the illustrated narrative, can be linked to the traditions of the Lubok art as well. And here we will show slide 1, please. The father's bald head is first described and then pictured in profile. His comparison to a bottle of vodka is furnished with a relevant picture. Now let's show the second one, please. The author advises the children, you children, to observe the father's head from the back, and the relevant picture is added. The subversive function of the images is particularly evident in the group scene described in the text as a quiet morning in the household. We can show slide 3 here. So this is a group scene, and it is described in the text as a quiet morning in the household. But as you can see, we have one child being beaten, another one complaining about his sibling, another one on the floor. We have one child sobbing, then a baby who is wailing, and then a little boy is playing his trumpet, and the mother is beating the child as well, and the father is negotiating with one of the children, and the nurse is trying to calm the baby. The caption under the original drawing borrowed by Chekhov for his story reads, "A happy pater familias." The image, and you also can see, because the announcement for this talk had this had an image of my cover, and the cover of the book is taken from this particular picture in a modified way. So the appropriated image is dynamic, evoking movement, sound, various perspectives of the figures, and the resulting chaos with the adults portrayed in adversarial position vis-a-vis the children. And significantly, this image, as well as several others chosen by Chekhov for the story, is in color, highlighting its narrative importance and enhancing its appeal for his intended audience. Chekhov actually writes in the story, in this story, that the reason that he gave you a picture of the good boy Grisha in color is because he's a good boy. So that was a reward for Grisha's good behavior. Besides that, the illustration offers an example of the widespread and most often unacknowledged borrowing of others' work by the authors and artists of the penny press. Excuse me, the way the figures are positioned, the focus on movement and implied noise, and the various subplots of the visual narrative gesturing to a family in crisis, as well as the comic edge of the image, can all be found in 2 of Pavel Fedotov's sketches. We can show the next slide, please. This is Fedotov's painting The Demise of Fidelka, Кончина Fidelki. And the next one, if you could show that one, is his 1847 picture, Christine, Baptism. So I wanted to show you many more slides, but I don't have time. We can return to the cover image. The main features that Chekhov's published stories about children share with the handwritten soft-boiled boots and the comic orientation of the comic orientation of the story, with its reversal of expectations, its intertextuality, questioning of standard assumptions about children. It also demonstrates Chekhov's intimate familiarity with context, in this case with norms of behavior established for children, and also with children's magazines and with didactic literature of the time. Like Soft-Boiled Boots, published children's stories by Chekhov are dynamic, theatrical, and also notable for their attention to the visual and sensory experiences, smells, noises, and colors. Now, I think I only have time to sum up, and this is what I will do. I analyzed many of Chekhov's stories about children and came to the following conclusions. The writer's depictions of childhood are rooted in his experiences as a journalist, physician, and a practitioner of the arts of the penny press. Unlike the experts in scholarly fields, Chekhov and his collaborators fully appreciated the difference between various discourses of their culture, using the ambiguity of the generic attribution to produce laughter. Yet, Chekhov's early work, including his work on children, was broader in its intent and more narratively amplified than that of his brothers in writing in the penny press. The general orientation of Chekhov's stories about children differed substantially from the literary canon of high literature as well. Chekhov's model does not articulate the self-construction of a particular class, as found in the novels by Aksakov or Tolstoy, or in the autobiographical novels they inspired. Chekhov's fictional childhood is equally distant from those of Dostoevsky's or Saltykov's Shchedrin's, whose representations aid in support of a unifying idea. Rather, the chief function of Chekhov's model is the study of childhood. Chekhov's informed appropriation of his contemporaries' views on medicine, child psychology, and education, as well as Chekhov's references to his children's school curricula, textbooks, or journals, serve to substantiate his descriptions, legitimize the implied author's presentation, and make him appear knowledgeable, as Chekhov urged writers to do in his autobiography. The main purpose of Chekhov's appropriations, however, is the elucidation of his characters' individual paths to individual truths. The same applies to Chekhov's use of literary and cultural contexts. The themes of loving or absent mothers, caring or neglectful fathers, romantic love, crimes and punishments, as well as Chekhov's portraits of suffering children, evoke prominent representations of childhood of Chekhov's time and form an instantly recognizable background for the writer's own exploration of maturation. The imagery and the ideology of the Russian traditional peasant culture, a significant part of the shared cultural background as well, is likewise appropriated by the writer. Again, all work to explore the ways children gain knowledge. Hence, like his contemporaries in education and psychology, Chekhov constructs his fictional childhood by focusing on how children develop and learn. In order to show how children learn, Chekhov demonstrates why his children seek knowledge, as well as what kind of knowledge they seek. Chekhov's young characters face illness, violence, separation from home, and death. They have to figure out the notions of marriage, sexuality, and the rules of socialization. Chekhov's children learn in order to make sense of their experiences, gain control over their immediate environment, and affect change. His young characters learn through close observation and transgression of established norms of behavior. They learn by forming suppositions and arriving at notions that are verified in interaction with others. In her composition, Chekhov's schoolgirl rewrites a poignant passage from Turgenev's romantic novel. A 7-year-old reimagines a woman's impending and unwanted marriage after Pushkin's narrative poem. The Art by a Motherless Child is yet another example of written, verbal, or visual texts by children that aim at making sense of the observed. The reshaping of what has been heard or seen before is therapeutic. Children restore themselves by restoring. This is Kathy Popkins' word. Overcoming the anxiety of ignorance through storytelling is prompted by the protagonist's push for control, their desire to gain agency in the established hierarchy of subject versus object, adult versus the child. Chekhov's children learn and play, acting out the puzzles of the outside world inside their own magic circle. When interacting with the adults, the child discovers the power of prohibition. In games with peers, the child masters the power of accommodation. While in play, children negotiate gender and class differences, engage in creative pretending, hone the art of communication, and train for their future social and family roles. They also learn in stages. Transitions from one developmental stage to the next do not occur steadily or smoothly, but rather in emotionally painful jumps. Chekhov looks at the preverbal child and pays attention to language acquisition in its intimate connection to cognition. He also considers the culmination of the first childhood at 7, a culturally crucial period of the transition to prepubescence. In Chekhov, the end of childhood occurs with the child's departure from home, the symbolic construct built around the internalized perception of familiarity, acceptance, and belonging. Chekhov also shows that his child's sensory abilities are more powerful than those of the adults, and his children often display synesthesia. Chekhov's literary depiction of maturation differs, however, from those offered by his literary precursors or the writer's contemporaries in the field of education and psychology in a number of important areas. Chekhov's pre-verbal child is more advanced in his cognitive abilities, and his imagination is highly developed. Gender differences are portrayed in a more focused and nuanced way. A mother's absence can be remedied by the child's emotional connection to another. Play is given much more importance in Chekhov and is described in terms approaching modern understanding. The division into developmental stages and the rationale underlying transitions from one developmental stage to another are closer to modern views on the issue. In a decisive shift from standard perceptions, the writer presents maturation as an uneven, jagged process of overcoming the deficits of understanding. Chekhov's depiction of his children's sexuality as sublimated in their imaginary narratives is similarly prescient. The discovery of the power of language to convey meaning and affect change is the key precondition for his character's intellectual and emotional growth. This cognitive breakthrough, however, is invariably accompanied by the realization that expression is never adequate to the thought being expressed, and that making oneself understood is a tremendous challenge. Most of Chekhov's protagonists' attempts at effective communication fail, as we know. Yet in Chekhov's stories about childhood, such communication can occur. Chekhov shows, however, that the bridging of the divide between separate consciousnesses is possible only in emotionally charged dialogical interactions that center on topics that vitally matter to the communicators. For Chekhov's young characters, childhood in the now is not innocent, blissful, or sweet, but painfully ignorant. It is the ignorance of Chekhov's children that makes their maturation so challenging and traumatic. The path to understanding is shown to be impeded by age, social position, gender, or family environment. Still, even if individual and unavoidably flawed, a knowledge is gained in the child's complex interactions with the world around. The refracted voices of Chekhov's contemporaries, as well as echoes of the writer's own childhood, are transformed in these narratives in linguistic and generic arrangements where the construction of knowledge assumes central importance. Thank you.
Nadja, thank you so much. And we'll turn now to Elizabeth White, our собеседник. Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you very much. I understand I've got 5 minutes, so I've just got a few comments.
Sure.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I studied Chekhov at university several decades ago. And I am guilty of misreading him, as Nadezhda has said, and sort of presuming, putting this kind of biographical approach of the good doctor and who had an unhappy childhood directly onto his literary works myself. So I found this paper really interesting to read and think about. So I've written a book on history of modern Russian childhood. So I'll just talk briefly about some of the thoughts from the 1860s onwards, which, as Nadezhda had said, saw sort of dramatic shifts in understandings and really interest in childhood. Childhood in Russia and the Soviet Union became extraordinarily important for key groups, in particular before, obviously, the Soviet Union, the intelligentsia in late imperial Russia, in many ways predating its massive interest in the Western world from the beginning of the 20th century, which becomes known as the century of the child. So from the Great Reforms, the defeat in Crimea, the Tsarist regime understands that there has to be universal primary education for the peasantry. So from 1864, they set up the Zemstvo and then the sort of Zemstvo school system. So it's coming from the state as well, but really the ideas are coming, as Nadezhda has shown, from sort of progressive intelligentsia ideas. So from the 1860s, you have these developments in progressive pedagogy, which were really child-centered in a way that was not necessarily so anywhere else. So people, men like Pirogov and Ushinsky, they not only rejected the earlier idea, but from Peter the Great, that the role of education was to produce sort of state servitors and produce to produce these kind of fully rounded human beings, which was quite different to ideas about pedagogy in Western Europe. And Nadezhda has pointed out I don't know if she mentioned it in this talk, but certainly in the longer paper, about this rejection. What's interesting here is this rejection of the Enlightenment idea of education as Vospitania, and more about a sort of a humanistic education that's linked to Narodnost. But what I wanted to say, and maybe we could reflect on as this about the 19th century, is this sort of dream of universal primary education was connected to ideas about modernization for many progressive intellectuals, and they wanted to change the Tsarist order, not just sort of replicate it, which was obviously why the Tsarist state becomes interested in education. And there was also these attacks on the authoritarian patriarchal family. And so these ideas weren't apolitical, that they were specifically about future of Russia and reproduction of the critically thinking intelligentsia. And I just wondered where that might sit with Chekhov, because I know that you say, he wasn't political, but you also say that the goal of his writings about children was to sort of show formation of autonomous subjects. So is that political, forming autonomous subjects? So another thing I wanted to mention was a reflection on methodology. So Nadezhda, you said you wanted to reach the goal of tracing the interplay between socio-political change, culture, and literature. And you know, that's so difficult, isn't it? And I'm sure in your book you've done that very well, and you've kind of alluded to your findings here, because individuals exist with so many layers of meaning and discourse. So, for example, what you say Chekhov was influenced by these contemporaneous developments in discourses of the child, particularly science, and you talk about experimental psychology, etc. But his stories also exist in a world before that, the world of the kind of chaos of the family, the patriarchal Russian family, the peasant exploitation of children, kids not the exit from childhood very early on. So how do you trace socio-political change when people are operating on so many different levels? And I wondered, I think that's probably me almost up, but I wondered briefly if we could say something about this phrase, the anxiety of ignorance. If you could say what that refers to in some more detail. So who is ignorant and what they're ignorant about? And are we talking about Russia? These ideas that Russia was behind the West in some way, that Russia was like a child, because often societies talk about development of children and map it onto their own societies, either through a sort of colonial lens or concerns about their own development. So I wondered if perhaps that's something we might think about. And I'd love to hear as well why Ushinsky is a hero, because I think you said in the longer paper that he was somebody that you very much admired.
Yeah. Is that
Thank
like
you.
you?
Thank you very much, Elizabeth,
To
for
begin
the remarks.
answering.
We'll go back to Nanda. Yeah.
Yeah, lots to unpack in your questions. Socio-political change, culture, and literature. That's a big one, but the purpose of, let me just rephrase it. What I was interested in, this book is about Chekhov, right? So what I was interested in was how these views, how these changes, how these different voices, opinions, how they transform themselves in his writing. We're not talking about him as a public figure because we know his position on the autonomous subject. He was all for it. We know that he was very concerned about suffering children, and particularly those who were sent from the village to work in the cities. We know all of that. We know his position. He was a progressive. He admired Belinsky. He read Pirogov, and he alludes to Pirogov's ideas. In fact, uses in one of his stories, there's a passage that is basically a quote from Pirogov. So the society was changing, was undergoing a tremendous change. They were thinking about children as people who will inhabit the society after they are gone. And he was describing it in his literary work. So what was happening outside? How was it affecting the way that he was representing this reality? That's what I'm interested in, right? So you can see him as a public figure, and you can understand what kind of a public figure he was, but I'm interested in Chekhov as a writer. And in his works, the characters do emerge as autonomous subjects. Absolutely. So, but that's not the focus. What I was trying to show in the book is that you cannot approach Chekhov with ready-made, easy framework. You have to refocus. And when you refocus, you see that what he's interested in, and it's not only about his children characters, in his more mature work, you see that happening as well. how do people arrive at their interpretations of what is going on? And nobody is privileged. Everybody has his own ideas about what is right and what is wrong. And how do they arrive at that? That is the central point of the duel, for example. And Chekhov begins that investigation in his story, Mальчики, the boys, these two characters who have their own ideas of what is right, and he contrasts them. In terms of the anxiety of ignorance, I think it's a perfect way to describe what was happening in that period, because they needed to know what to do. So when you look at what Ushinsky did, and he is my hero, not only because he was a superb teacher, and Institutki, whom he taught at Smolny, wrote memoirs about how fantastic he was as a teacher, but also because he was responsible for creating all kinds of pedagogical periodicals, and he wrote this work that I mentioned that had everything that a teacher might need. All of the current knowledge on physiology and psychology was summarized. He knew several languages, so he translated the stuff first in his articles, then in that big volume for future teachers, so that they were, as Chekhov would say, well informed. And who are these people? I have page 87 of my book, a huge list of people he translated and summarized in his pedagogical anthropology. They're all from the West, beginning with Comenius and, of course, Rousseau and Locke and everybody else. So that is the reason why I feel justified in saying that was the age of, that was anxiety of ignorance there, definitely.
Thank you, Nadia. Maybe we can open the floor up to questions, just to make sure that anyone who wants to can intervene. And I'll give it a minute. Thank you both, Nadia and Elizabeth.
I have a question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I was just thinking about Chekhov's plays, and I mean, most of them are from a later period, and I was wondering if there are any children in his plays, and the only one I can think of is the young boy who has died before the play begins that we're told about in the cherry orchard, and if that is somehow symptomatic of decrease. I mean, obviously all of the characters have very are guided by their childhood experiences in important ways. But I was wondering if you could say something about a switch away from children, from characters who are children, or maybe a switch, a lack of interest in putting children in theater productions, or just, I don't know, whatever comes to mind on that.
That is a very interesting question. I think that with the step, I think Chekhov felt that he said everything he had to say, because it feels like the chapter there in the book, I call it the farewell to childhood. Mm-hmm. And there are all kinds of images that point to the notion of farewell in the book. In Chekhov's, I call it novel. Many people think it's a novella, but I call it a novel. I think he probably felt that it was done. It was done. I mean, that is the first thing that comes to mind. I have to think about it harder. But when I was talking, responding to Elizabeth's comments, I mean, these characters, they live on, but they become adults. When you look at Laevsky and von Koren in The Duel, these are the characters that you also see in his children's stories. You can see it in the boys, the Mальчики. These two boys, one a dreamer who cannot act on his dreams, and the other one a doer who is not artistic enough to create a dream. So, and there is a contrast, and there is a change, and there is a confrontation, and all of that is explored in that story. I mean, the subtitle to the book is from this fantastic critic, Gromov, and he says all Chekhov stories are children's stories, right? It's like when after the 80s, you see what these children become, maybe when they're adults.
Mhm.
That I have to think about it. That's a great question.
I wonder maybe how many children were put on stage in that era. I mean, maybe
Well, that's a very good practical question.
I don't know. Maybe it just wasn't done. It's not my field of expertise. So.
I think what they did was they used little women, small stature women. Yeah, that's what I think.
I see Chloe Kitzinger has a question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for the great talk. I have a question that I think follows on Sarah's, which is about genre and whether you see the children's story as a kind of genre in itself. In Chekhov, I mean, from what you just said, it sounds like in some sense all of his stories you said are children's stories, but I'm particularly thinking of the one that I imagine many know best, Spatrochitsa, which is sort of a horror story, right? I read it as a horror story. And I wonder how often there is that kind of genre play in Chekhov stories about children, or again, if you see them as kind of a generic group. And then the other question I had, which is really selfish, I've always wondered why there isn't more children's literature from late 19th century Russia, thinking especially about the Victorian tradition, and this being the time when this amazing children's literature tradition is kind of taking shape in English. And I just wondered if you had any comment on that, having worked on this period and this topic.
Yeah, on the issue of the genre, all of his children's stories, with the exception of The Steppe, are written in a particular genre. Well, the first one belongs to the genre of the trifles, which were common in the penny press, and the last one is The Steppe. But in between, all of those stories are written in the form of the dramatic sketch, Senka. And that was that he inherited from working for the satirical journals, but amplified it. And you can and there are certain, Kataev describes this particular genre very well. There are certain accoutrements of this genre, and the way that the story begins develops the reversal of expectations in the end, relies on dialogue, and often metaphorical names for the characters. That is very characteristic of the story, but he amplified it because even in the trifles, you see that it's not just for laughs. There is something else there. There is a beautiful little funny story. It's about this girl who it's her work that she has, summer homework that she has to do. She has to write a composition, she has to do a math problem, she has to do some particular sentences and so on. And you can see that, and that genre was a staple of the comic story, right? Genre in Russia at that time. but there are seeds of possible plots. I mean, she's immature. She for her composition, she rewrites Turgenev's romantic novel, takes a passage and she says "pahishana." She steals it basically and then modifies it and so on. But then you see that he's showing that she is not just a stereotype, but she is an individual girl with individual family, with individual quirks, and she's going through a very difficult time. So, and that's, the story is 2 pages, but you get it all from there. So the rest of them is written in the form of the dramatic sketch, very well established genre in that period. Spite Хочется, even Spite Хочется has a few elements of that dramatic sketch. It's dramatic. It begins with one word. And then there is a reversal of expectations in the end. I devoted quite a lot of pages to that story in my book because I felt it was very, very important. And I have the last chapter of the book is called The After Childhood. There are 2 stories that I describe in that chapter. It's that time when you leave home, but you have not yet arrived into adulthood. And it usually coincides in these stories, departure from home. So that story, yeah. And also it's very interesting how well he's informed as a scientist about sleep deprivation. Because one of the heroes for me in the pedagogical movement was this incredible woman who wrote a huge volume on dream, sleep as a physical condition. And what she describes there is what he describes in the story. So very well aware. And she was very forward-looking for her time. I mean, her stuff is still relevant in terms of sleep. What do we call them? Problems. Yeah.
I see we have a question from Joseph Bradley. Thank you, Nadia.
So thank you for a very interesting talk. If I may call you Nadia, we met many, many years ago at
Oh. Oh my God.
right?
Oh my
You
God.
probably knew me by the name that everybody calls me, Brad, in the dormitory at MGO, right? So anyway,
Wow.
can you say anything about punishment of children, particularly outside the home, outside the family, but punishment by, let's say, the authorities or the state? I mean, the one story I can think of is Zlopramichniki, and there's some boys who need a sinker for their fishing pole, and they steal a bolt from the railroad.
Well, no, that's not a boy. Zlomyshlenik, it's not a boy. It's a little.
These are older. These are adults.
Yes, yes. That particular criminal is a man, a peasant, a very, very wily one. That
Well-
story I remember very well. But in terms of punishment, everywhere. I mean, physical punishment in schools referred to in many stories. Physical punishment, of course, in Vainka, in Spite Хочется, in the story that I showed you, the funny story about the family, everybody's beating everybody else, the children, right? The tutor beats them, the father beats them. Everybody is very violent towards these children. And it was a huge issue for the educators, because since Catherine the Great abolished corporal punishment in schools, everybody followed suit, but it was everywhere still. So,
But I was thinking of punishment kind of outside the home, as it were, outside the family, but by either by institutions or by the state, let's say. I mean, in Spot Horchitsa, right? The girl, it ends, doesn't it end? Talk about an open ending. She's not, I mean, we don't know what happens, but she suffocates a baby, right? So,
well, the thing is that it is, and that is, that is such a dense story because, as Kathy Popkin said, you have to analyze his stories as poetry, and it is true, particularly for this story, because the notion of suffocation is carried through in different ways, in different words, but douche, 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 douche is there. So we know, I mean, subliminally, we are being prepared for the conclusion. We don't know what happens to her because he doesn't tell you, and he will not tell you, which is great. That difficult relationship with the reader, where the reader has to work harder and figure out for himself. And I find it great. Yeah, because we're all brought up on Tolstoy, where he writes a story and then appends the explanation for, in Kreutzer Sonata, I think it was, where he had an explanation of how to read his work and what to derive from it. Well, Chekhov will not give you that. So, but it's just fantastic to see you. Do you know Ben is gone, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. We were all together at the University of Moscow. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, this has been very enjoyable and enlightening. And I mean, for me, what it does is it helps me kind of disassociate children and death in Chekhov, because honestly, when I think of children in Chekhov, I think of children dying. And that is something that sort of gets the plot going, like in Vragi, or that is a turning point, like in Vavrage. And I remember the first time I taught Chekhov years ago, when memes were sort of a new thing. The students made a meme of my face. They found my smiling face somewhere, and then they put over it in big white letters, "The baby dies."
We shouldn't be laughing
Because
the baby dies.
that was, I think, their experience of Chekhov. So it's very good to remember that there are live children in Chekhov, and that they're so interesting. And I think it's time for us to wrap up. But thank you so much, Nadia and Elizabeth, both.
Thank you very much
for doing this. Yeah, it was great. Much
totally
appreciated. Bye bye.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun. Thank you.
До свидания, до свидания.
До свидания.
До свидания. Bye.